Thank you, Renee. A cordial welcome, and please accept my apologies for my late arrival. Now, one of our conferences, which normally always takes place end of February, was held 1 month later this time, and that is why I had to talk about 27 special wines and had to introduce them to my audience. But now I'm here, and later on, of course, I have also the opportunity to present some wines which you will have the opportunity to taste. Anyway, PIWIs. PIWIs and the VitiFit project. Thank you very much for that, because I have to say, I'm now 62 years old. It has really broadened my view and actually changed my view of certain things fundamentally, and I'm really grateful for this, because I'm now much more passionate about them. When I have young people where I give lectures, whether at the university or technical college, to really convince them of it. And now in times of crisis where cost saving is so important, that people think much more about sustainability. And I think that's great. Wonderful that we cooperate so successfully as part of such a big consortium. So perhaps you can show my slides. So PIWIs on everyone's lips. Not so easy, actually, to get them on everyone's lips, because there are some obstacles to achieving that. We heard about them. And that is the reason why, when we wrote our application, we decided that we needed to have a group that would turn the grapes into very tasty, exciting, mouth-watering wines. We don't want to have watery wines, certainly not mouth-watering wines. So must-drink wines. That was the task we'd set ourselves. And that is precisely what we worked on here at the wine campus in Neustadt. We had a vineyard. Jochen Buchs actually planted it, and he did never receive approval for his project. 5 years later, however, for us, things were much more auspicious. That is how things happen sometimes in the life of a researcher. So we got the approval, and this is a slide that I nicked from others. You may have heard about this, but when it comes to the marketing of PIWI, I mean, that has always been the snag, the problem of PIWIs. So there is a lot of room for improvement, 50%. That is what you can see here. And that is the mandate we set ourselves, to do a bit of product development, really, in order to overcome the barriers that you can see listed here. So how did we set about achieving this? We had the vineyard where we grew the PIWI varieties and also the traditional ones alongside of each other. We harvested them, vinified them, 4 different styles, such as mash heating, bleeding, oaked. Now, because we didn't really have large quantities, so we used oak casks. Later on, during the master degree, also worked on fermentation on skins. The organic vintners received feedback from us. We also surveyed, of course, consumers. We also analyzed the chemistry behind it. Now, you might think it's all easily done, but it's not in the midst of a pandemic. But everything worked out pretty well for us in the end. And for the organic wine growers and also for enologists, we were able to filter out key elements from the consumer survey we conducted in order to boost demand for PIWIs, to make sure that expectations are met. We fed back the insights back into the process. So we had 3 years, 2019, 20, and 21. And we talked about our work. We communicated this. I think Mark Webb and myself, we gave a total of 55 talks, speaking to more than 5,000 people. That is why I'm so grateful to this project. Obviously, it was perceived as very exciting. So we're still the same, but what we worked on was also very exciting. That is why there were so many workshops and other events. So here's the vineyard and 4 PIWI varieties: Calades Blanc, Muscaris, Sauvignac, and Cabernet Blanc. And the reference varieties, you can see them here. Now, we had repetitions, randomization, everything else, and the 2 red varieties. We had the PIWI, the Laurel, the Merlot from the State Winery, and from our Freiburg colleagues, the Cabernet Cortez. So what we're excelling at is descriptive analytics. That is what we did with organic wine growers, 72 of them, sometimes 90. Sometimes we had this to split this up. Well, this was pretty challenging when we started our work. And another one was, how do you work with consumers if they cannot come to see you? And that is why we filled the wine into small bottles, 2,800 of them, then sent them to German, Danish, and French consumers, and in the years after to Italian and Dutch consumers. And back at home, they opened these 5 bottles. They were also given a proper tasting glass, not your ordinary teeth brushing glass. And they were then asked for their opinions, and I learned that this is really the gold standard. You cannot top that in terms of consumer analysis, because at home is where most people drink most of the wine. So, and that is why the pandemic was actually quite good for us and presented us with this opportunity. Now, here you can see the tasting with the organic wine growers, and you can see the distances that we needed to adhere to because of the pandemic. You can see that in the picture. And then we tasted the wines, and I'll give you the results shortly. Now, whenever you can see the color green, then the PIWI wine was significantly better compared to the wine it was compared against. Amber means it was equally good, and when it was red, for example, like the Muscaris, for example, then it did not perform as well. And a colleague of mine, he actually studied maths in the past, so he really knows statistics, and he really did excellent work. And what can we see? When you ask the organic wine growers over a span of 3 years, it was the PIWI wine that was as good, and in many cases even better, 13 times better, 19 times equally good, and only 1 time not as good. So I'm sure that will have contributed to bringing people round, and then we talked to the consumers. And we were only able to do 2 actually rounds, and never underestimate your consumer. The PIWIs that were harvested too early, prematurely, had not been fully developed, and we weren't able to interfere at that late stage in the vineyard, and that is how we found out. So never underestimate your consumers and their opinion. The PIWI still ended up being 5 times better, 14 times equally good, and only in 3 cases there was this slightly woody note. And that is an important message, of course, this sends. See, the colleagues are there. So you can actually cultivate these varieties, provided that you invest enough effort into the enological side of it, if you see to it that the wine style is up to date and that you really play to the fortes of that variety, and that in that case you cannot just be equally good but even be better compared to the traditional wines. Now, this is the consumer view again, and here, just bear with me, down here you can see the experts that were included. We really learned our lesson. So that is in the year 2021. So first year, second, third vintage. So you really learn how to handle the different varieties better with time. Let me give an explanation why the Riesling didn't perform so well. It had to do with a high level of acidity. Now, on a scale from 1 to 9, it scored 1 point less, and the Calades Blanc in this comparison performed better, because during the aging time, we were able to really emphasize the tropical fruit inherent in that wine. Hence, the Calades Blanc, and when it was oaked, we were able to impart a special fragrance to it, which was regarded as positive. Then the Sauvignac and Cabernet Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc, if you compare these, you can see that the 2 Sauvignon Blanc perform better, and the So the Sauvignacs perform better, the Sauvignon Blanc worse. And if you look why that is so, you can see that the Cabernet Blanc and also the Sauvignac actually showed yellow fruit, tropical fruit, and were hensely more intense in flavor. Also, the fruitiness emerged more clearly. However, in the case of a premature harvest, the acidity and the green flavors were too conspicuous. It's important to learn our lessons here. So how to handle what? For example, if we leave the clusters on the vine for longer, for example, we can simply improve it. So all of these are things that we can then, lessons learned, which we can then pass on to others. Now, it was also interesting to see what would happen with the polyphenols. Some people believe, and I don't share this view or belief, as to how varieties can form more polyphenols. Some people believe that it has to do with certain processes. Now, if you look at the resveratrol, it only has a few milligrams compared to 200 kilograms of flavonols. You can see that you cannot compare apples and oranges. But what we've learned is that the varieties that were cultivated in Freiburg tend to have higher levels of phenols, and this is from a work conducted by Martin Nadach. So 10% of fermentation on skins complete or half the standing time, whereas in the Muscaris, actually, the phenolic content really skyrocketed, while the Sauvignac, in the case of the Sauvignac, that seemed to be immune to this. It had more maturity, different maturity on the skin. Similar with the Cabernet Blanc, a steep increase, and that is what we would have expected. But this is very important information that we can learn from this, say what variety is better suited for an orange wine, say, and where you have to be a little bit more careful, perhaps. Let's move on to the user. Now we will look at multivariate statistics here, but never fear, I'm going to guide you through these colorful dots. Now this was a two-dimensional representation here. On the right in green, Sauvignac, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Blanc, and the Calaris Blanc, with its different versions. Then the Riesling, that's farther apart than the Muscatella and the Muscaris. And this here was a repeat. So we presented the same wine twice, and you can see how well they performed. You can see that they were really close to each other. So simply by conducting a cluster analysis in the groups that emerged, you can see, for example, the Calaris or Muscatella, they were more fruity. Muscatella was somewhere in between, still aromatic, but slightly less green notes, less fruity compared to the Sauvignon Blanc. The Riesling came as a bit of a disappointment. Same area, same winemakers, same yeasts used, but it performed less well compared to the ones over here and the Calaris Blanc that have been harvested too early. Now, let's look at the consumer. So this is how we pre-positioned the different wines. You can see what they preferred and what they rejected. Now, we wanted to know the reasons why. First of all, we can see that the traditional varieties aren't always the preferred ones. Now, I hasten to add that our users did not know that it was a Riesling or a Sauvignon Blanc or a Calaris Blanc. So all the samples have been anonymized. And the varieties actually play quite a larger role compared to the aged versions. And each of these yellow dots is a user, and you can see by and large preferences tended towards this direction because the cloud of the users tended towards the right. Now, there were some stalwart Riesling lovers or lovers of more acidic wines, but on the whole, you can see the floral, full-bodied, sweeter variants, tropical fruit. That was what was mostly preferred, whereas the hard mouthfeel, honey, and green flavors were mostly rejected. Now, that was already an important insight. It showed us what we would need to focus on. Next, we decided to look at French users, French consumers. Now here the clouds moved in this direction, and interestingly enough, this is what they appreciate: spicy, floral, full-bodied, sweet and fruity. And if you transfer this, apply this to the left, you can see which wines they preferred and which ones they would tend to reject. So the Calades Blanc, Muscaris, Muscatella. It was really fascinating to see. Now let's move on to the Danes. As Mark Dressler just mentioned, because Scandinavians, of course, really set great store by sustainability. They have other preferences: yellow fruit, tropical fruit, citric fruit. In other words, Sauvignon Blanc, Sauvignac. That seems to be the preferred flavors of the Danish, and that is why they tend to prefer Calades Blanc, Cabernet Blanc, and Sauvignac, whereas the floral wines and the more acidic ones seem to be the preserve of our colleagues in the south. Preferred wines there. So we were able to form two clusters for Germany now. One was for floral wines, and the other one's, well, more Calades Blanc, perhaps because it's more similar to the Pinot Blanc or Riesling. So we then summarized all these learnings and then set about communicating this, what the points were you needed to watch out for. So also regarding the harvest and high yields, we found out about sparkling wine, base wines. Rotkäppchen, for example, they plant 100 hectares of base wine for their sparkling wine to develop a sustainable version or brand. And the third one they're going to use here is Calades Blanc. We showed that the fermentation times, of course, led to more full-bodied and wines, and that oaking would lead to a leaner but also a stronger wine. And then the cuvées. We didn't really have the time to work on cuvées, but I think that would have been worthwhile as well. Let's move on to the reds. And you will know the names, the name conventions. Now, when it comes to the reds, we have to practice. We had the Lauro and the Cabernet Cortis. They did not perform equally well. Perhaps too many phenols, too much Buxa. Nevertheless, during the second year, we significantly improved. So we learnt our lesson, and in the third year, it was even better. Not all the wine growers have to make the same mistakes. We will communicate our lessons learned, and else we will facilitate the whole process and help to successfully establish wine styles that will be sought after. So 2 times significantly better. You can see that. Now let's look at the consumers. Now they criticized phenolic contents that were too high. In the second year, they were quite happy with our wines and attested a better or equally good quality to the PIWIs. And in the third year, the picture improved even further. Now, for us, it was important to look at the phenolic structure. That is why in 2019 we had so many red dots, because the Cabernet Cortis and the way we aged it had too many phenols, had harsh tannins. It was too dry. So that taught us a lesson. We looked at how we could reduce this using enology and in terms of viticulture. But if you don't know this, you can really get it wrong. 25 years ago, for example, we didn't know that the Regent included so many reductants. Now, these are the phenols which during titration serve to determine the free, or which pretend there is SO2, even though it's not there. So they filled the wine with a very high, well, much higher content than they would have thought. And that is why people said, now the region tends towards high oxidation. No, they didn't know about these reductants, the wine growers. And that is the reason why we, as part of the VitiFit project, decided to tackle this kind of issue in order to get it wrong again. And You can see here the higher phenolic content, and hence I'd like to thank again for the funding we received from the ministry that we were able to do this for 3 years, because if you only have 2 years to base your work on, that's not good enough. You need more space, more time in order to find out about all the things that can go wrong and to take counteraction. So Cabernet Cortis had a phenolic content that was too high. That's now well known. But by and large, of course, PIWIs do have a higher phenolic contents, but you can do something about this enologically. And you can see the anthocyanins, and you can also see what happens. Whereas the Cabernet Cortis still has the malvidin D-glucoside, so it's a marker that is used for breeding. You can see that there are some American genes in here. So the breeders of Loro and Merlot decided to do away with this thanks to assisted breeding. Now in Germany, perhaps that's less important, but in Italy or in other EU countries, people really stick to the letter of what OIV says, that the maximum level of malvidin D-glucoside is 15 milligrams per liter. And that, of course, is an impediment when it comes to introducing it to Italy, Spain, or France. But you can see advances have been made by the breeders, and they've taken up on this. And also, if we look at the aroma analysis, thermovinification has a much greater bearing compared to the different varieties. And when I talk to the people at the different sellers and the people from the cooperatives, they were really relieved to hear that we heated the mash, because that is normally what they do, the method they resort to on their red wines. But this also, of course, is useful in the case of PIWIs. Now let us look at the consumers. 177. You can see Satin Noir, heated mash and oaked, Cabernet Sauvignon in the middle, also heated mash, then the Cabernet Cortis, the Lauro, and the reference is the Merlot. And the French wines, well, the French preferences were widely distributed, but mostly tended in this direction. So it had a lot to do with color, fruity, cherry, dark fruit, and they don't like astringent wines, perhaps because they prefer their Burgundy to others. But that was what they mostly rejected. Now the Danes were closer to the French in this case, but they prefer the green flavors that we have in Cabernet and Cabernet Cortis. It's a well-known fact that the French don't like the green pyrrhizins because they tend to say, well, this vineyard is not good enough for this variety, so let's get rid of them. And also the German users, you can see that a lot of them set great store by color. Actually, a lot of purchasing departments in food retail or wine retail do the same. Dark fruit over here on the top left. So we worked on the wine style, or looked at the wine style, and talked about this in many, many lectures in Austria, Italy, elsewhere. But anyway, we've amassed a lot of know-how on the subject, and a lot of information has been published. I'm not quite sure who was the first to show this, whether it was Mark and his colleagues or whether it was me. But if something's good, you can talk about it twice. So at eye level with traditional varieties. So this is a Me Too product, as I like to say. I think that's fine because for 50 years, we've been teaching people to look at the variety. So when we say the Sauvignon Gris is as good as a Pinot Gris, for example, then that can really clinch the deal. And now PIWI is, of course, a brand that we're hoping to establish, as we said. And in this case, it's good that it doesn't say, for example, Pinot Noir or Riesling, but it shows that something new is being set up here and created, a brand in its own right. And that is why our names can really set a special accent, as it were. So we can simply send a message here by using the appropriate emblems, symbols, or whatever. And another segment that is small but important. If you spray only once or twice in the vineyard, if you're much more sustainable, why don't you combine that with an enological practice where you interfere as little as possible? So you try to give free rein to nature and control a minimum. So spontaneous fermentation and things like that. And tonight we're going to try out something similar, such as this amber wine from Zähringer or by Zähringer. And I think for some markets, such as Scandinavian markets or South Korea, that will be important. Here we can really offer and sell high-quality wine at very good prices. Now, let me summarize without repeating everything again. So I conclude, as I see it, this project has changed the wine. So fundamentally, now, I wouldn't say I'm completely converted, but I've moved from somebody who tended to be slightly ignorant in terms of enology. I have become an enologist who now embraces these varieties. And actually, I was also inspired by what the market says. Now, these are presentations or lectures, of course, given together with the different organic associations and others. So in 2022, we gave 21 lectures, and in the years 23, 24, there were more lectures. So our audience included more than 5,000. Some will have visited these events twice, which isn't such a bad thing either. And actually, never before in a project, that is something that I've accomplished. So it's a great story to share, I think. So therefore, let me say thank you to the many colleagues at Neustadt who contributed to this, in particular Mark Weber, our doctoral assistant, then Ole Kohlmann and Maike Genter, who both were in charge of consumer research. Jutta did aroma research, but also Fabio, for example, and Benedict. They aged the wines in Freiburg, and then also all the funding was important. So progress was made. It was a great project. Thank you very much for this, and perhaps you have questions now. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank, Uli, für den
Well, thank you, Uli, for this very passionate presentation. Now, I can't wait for the PIWI tasting that you are going to host later on tonight. Any questions now, or perhaps in the chat? Now, you talked about an MV of 3.5.
Nein, der Malvidin.
No. The Malvidin has a very strong color, but that does not have any negative effects on the health. It's just a second sugar that comes in. But in terms of the sensory characteristics or its chemistry, it's got nothing to do with a Brexer fault. It simply means that there's a lack of nitrogen and that the yeast didn't get enough oxygen. So if you know that that's the case, you can add a different yeast and you can add more nitrogen in order to level that out. So much about the Brexer.
Hier vorne, Herr Hoffmann.
Was weiß man denn über das Alterungspotenzial?
Now, what about the aging potential of the red wines? Well, I think what you have in mind is the red PIWIs, right? Yes, well, 2 years ago when we had the breeding conference in Landau, we took a wine from our treasure trove. Vintage was 2000. And I have to say, I wasn't ashamed to show it around to my Italian and French colleagues. Now, on the downside, we lack experience. If you taste red wines, which we made 30 years ago here in the Baden region, you will feel actually that we weren't exactly complete experts, really. There were some things that were beyond our control. But now we can look back on 20 years of experience with the different varieties, so we can listen to their advice. But I don't think there's a general problem, really, or obstacle. The question is how much effort you want to put in the cellar or in the vineyard. So what's the vineyard like, for example? So these are the factors. It's less to do with the genetic makeup, really, of these varieties, which would prevent us from producing great wines from them.